I was 23 when my mom casually told me I wasn't born to her. It didn't even sound dramatic at first, because we were just sitting in the kitchen like always, drinking tea, and she said it in the same tone she used to remind me to buy bread. I remember I laughed a little, because I thought she meant adoption, like a joke we'd never discussed, but then she looked at me in this very steady way and said, "No, I mean I bought you, from the hospital." And the weirdest part is, she didn't look guilty or emotional, she just looked tired, like she was finally done carrying something heavy. At first I didn't know how to react, because my brain kept trying to turn it into something normal, something explainable, like maybe she meant paperwork, or some kind of legal adoption fee, but then I asked her, "What do you mean you bought me?" And she just shrugged a little and said, exactly what I said. So I sat there, holding my cup, and I could actually feel my hands starting to shake, but I tried to keep my voice calm because I needed her to keep talking, and I said, "Okay, start from the beginning." She took a slow breath, like she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times but still didn't know where to start, and then she said that back then, when she was younger, she couldn't have children, and it wasn't something people talked about openly, especially in our town, because everyone expected you to get married and have kids and just be normal, and she wasn't. She told me she had been trying for years, going to doctors, spending money she didn't really have, and every time the answer was the same, that it just wasn't going to happen naturally. And she said that at some point, she stopped telling people the truth, because the questions became too much, so she just smiled and said, "It will happen soon." And then one day, someone she barely knew, like a distant acquaintance, mentioned that there were ways to solve the problem, but not through official channels, and my mom said at first she ignored it, because it sounded wrong, but the idea stayed in her head. I remember interrupting her there, asking, "What kind of ways?" But she didn't answer directly, she just said, "Desperate ones." Then she told me that after a few months, she contacted that person again, and they introduced her to a woman who worked at a hospital, and everything was very quiet, very careful, like people didn't say things directly, they just hinted, and my mom understood that there were babies whose mothers didn't want them, or couldn't keep them, and instead of going through the system, they could be placed somewhere else. When she said that, I felt this cold wave go through me, because suddenly it didn't sound abstract anymore, it sounded very real, and very illegal, and very close to me. I asked her, "So you knew from the beginning?" And she nodded and said yes, she knew it wasn't legal, but she told herself that she was giving a child a better life, and at the same time she was giving herself a chance to finally be a mother. Then she looked at me and said, "And I chose you." That part hit me in a strange way, because it sounded almost loving, but also deeply unsettling, like I was something on a shelf. I asked her how that even worked, and she said she was told to come to the hospital on a specific day, and not ask too many questions, and when she got there, everything was very normal on the surface, people walking around, nurses doing their jobs, nothing that would make you think something unusual was happening. And then a woman took her aside, into a small room, and showed her a baby. She paused there, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly now, which was the first sign that this wasn't as easy for her as she tried to make it sound. I asked quietly, "Was that me?" She nodded and said yes, and then she added that there wasn't a long process, no meetings, no bonding time, just a quick decision, because everything had to be done fast and without attention. I couldn't help it, I asked, "What about my real mother?" And for the first time, my mom hesitated. She looked down at the table, tracing a small circle with her finger, and said, "I wasn't told much." And that's when something inside me tightened, because until that moment, the story felt like something from far away, something that happened before I existed, but now it suddenly felt like there was another person in the picture, someone who had been there at the very beginning of my life. I leaned forward and asked, "Did she know? Did she give me away?" My mom didn't answer right away, and that silence felt louder than anything she had said so far. And then she finally said, very quietly, "That's the part one was never sure about." That answer just sat there between us, and I could feel something shifting inside me, because up until that moment I was trying to understand her, but now I needed to understand where I actually came from. So I asked her directly, "What do you mean you weren't sure?" And she took a deep breath and finally dropped the part she had clearly been avoiding. She said the woman at the hospital told her that the baby's mother had refused, but there were no papers, no signatures, nothing official, just words, and my mom admitted that she didn't ask for proof because she was afraid that if she asked too many questions, the whole thing would disappear. I remember I stood up at that point and started pacing around the kitchen, because I needed to move. I couldn't just sit there and process it calmly, and I said, "So you don't actually know if she gave me away willingly?" And my mom looked at me and said, "No. I don't know." That was the first moment I felt something close to anger, not loud or explosive, but heavy and sharp, because this wasn't just about her anymore, it was about another woman, and about me, and about something that might have been taken, not given. I asked her if she had anything, any documents, any names, anything at all, and at first she said no, but then after a few seconds, she got up and went to her bedroom. I could hear drawers opening, things being moved around, and when she came back, she had a small envelope in her hand. She placed it on the table like it weighed a lot more than it should, and said, "This is all I have." Inside there was a folded piece of paper, slightly yellowed, and a hospital bracelet with a number on it. No name, just a date, a time, and that number. I picked it up, and it felt surreal, like holding a piece of someone else's life that somehow belonged to me. I asked her why she kept it, and she said, "Because I knew one day you might ask." So I did the only thing that made sense in that moment. I said, "I'm going to find out." She didn't try to stop me, she just nodded slowly, like she had already accepted that this would happen eventually. Over the next few weeks, my life turned into something completely different, because I started digging into records, asking questions, going back to that hospital, which thankfully was still there, though a lot had changed. At first, no one wanted to talk, because as soon as I mentioned the year and what I suspected, people became cautious, and I could tell this wasn't something they wanted to reopen. But I kept coming back, asking in different ways, until eventually I found an older nurse who had worked there around that time. She didn't confirm anything right away, but when I showed her the bracelet, her expression changed slightly, like she recognized something. She asked me where I got it, and I told her the truth, at least the part one knew, and after a long pause, she said, "Things were different back then." We sat down, and she explained that there had been situations where young mothers, especially those alone or in difficult circumstances, were pressured, sometimes heavily, to give up their babies, and not always through official adoption channels. I asked her if babies were ever taken without full consent, and she didn't answer directly, but she said, there were cases where the line wasn't very clear. That was enough for me to keep going. Using the date and time from the bracelet, I managed to get access to archived birth records, and it wasn't easy, but eventually I found a match. There was a name. A woman who had given birth on that exact date, at that exact time. And next to it, a note that simply said, "Child transferred." No further explanation. I wrote the name down, and I remember just staring at it for a long time, because for the first time, this wasn't abstract anymore, it was a real person. It took me another week to find her, because she no longer lived in the same city, but I eventually tracked down an address. I didn't tell my mom I was going, I just got on a bus and went. The whole way there, my mind kept running through different scenarios, like what if she didn't want to see me, what if she didn't even remember, what if I was about to destroy someone's life just by showing up. But when I finally stood in front of the door, I knew I couldn't turn back. I knocked, and after a few seconds, I heard footsteps. The door opened, and there was a woman, probably in her late 40s or early 50s, looking at me with confusion. For a moment, neither of us said anything, and then I asked, "Did you give birth on?" And I said the date. Her face changed instantly. Not confusion anymore, something deeper, something like shock. She stepped back slightly and said, "Who are you?" And I just said, "I think I might be your daughter." There was a long silence, and then she covered her mouth with her hand, like she was trying to hold something in. She let me in, and we sat down, and I showed her the bracelet, the paper, everything. She started crying quietly, and after a while, she said, "They told me you died." That sentence just stopped everything. I felt like the air had been pulled out of the room, and I asked, "What do you mean?" She explained that after she gave birth, she was exhausted, alone, and scared, and the doctors told her there were complications, and that the baby didn't survive. She said she didn't even get to see me properly, just for a moment, and then they took me away. And that was it. No body, no documents, just words. I sat there, trying to process it, and at the same time, everything suddenly made sense in a way that felt both clear and unbearable. I told her what my mom had told me, about the arrangement, about the hospital, about everything, and she just kept shaking her head slowly, like she had suspected something all these years but never had proof. We talked for hours, filling in pieces from both sides, and by the end of it, there was no doubt left. I hadn't been given away. I had been taken. When I went back home, my mom was waiting for me. She didn't ask anything right away, she just looked at me, and I think she already knew from my face that things weren't what she had hoped. I sat down across from her, and I told her everything, every detail, without raising my voice, without accusing her directly, just laying it all out. She listened, and as I spoke, her expression slowly changed, like something inside her was breaking piece by piece. When I finished, there was a long silence. And then she said, very quietly, "I didn't know." I looked at her, and for the first time I believed her completely. Not because it made things easier, but because it matched everything I had seen. She hadn't asked questions because she was afraid of the answers. And now we both had them. She asked me, "What happens now?" And I didn't have a perfect answer, because there wasn't one. So I just said, "I'm going to see her again." My mom nodded, and after a moment, she said, "Can I come with you, one day?" I didn't answer right away. I stood up, walked to the door, and before leaving, I turned back and said, "Not yet." Then I stepped outside, pulled out my phone, and dialed the number she had given me. She picked up almost immediately, like she had been waiting. And I said, "Hi, it's me." There was a small pause on the line, and then her voice, shaking but clear, said, "Are you coming back?" And I said, "Yes. I'm on my way."